The Trump administration is still holding firm to its claim that 37-year-old Alex Preddy wasn't just an innocent protester in the lead up to his fatal shooting by federal agents. No, they're not doing that. In the words of Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino, Preddy was at the scene to, quote, do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. But footage of the shooting paints a very different picture. In a new Washington Post analysis, zoomed-in footage appears to show a federal agent removing the handgun Preddy was legally carrying just moments before another agent shoots him multiple times.
The first thing that should make you pause here is not the video. It is not the gun. It is not even the shooting. It is the speed. The speed with which a human being went from alive to dead, and then almost instantly from unknown to fully defined by the government that killed him. Before evidence was reviewed, before investigators arrived, before anyone outside the agency had control of the scene, a story was already finished, motives assigned, intent declared, danger asserted. That timing matters more than people want to admit, because when power tells a story faster than facts can breathe, the outcome is usually predetermined.
Yet, within hours of his death, senior DHS officials publicly labeled Preddy a domestic terrorist, claiming he intended to, quote, massacre law enforcement with a semi-automatic handgun.
If you care about how authority behaves when it feels cornered, stay with this. And if you want more scrutiny like this, subscribe so this conversation keeps going. What happens after that speed is where this starts to get uncomfortable, because there is a long American history of deaths at the hands of the state being followed by certainty instead of caution. Not investigation, not restraint, certainty. The kind that arrives fully formed. The kind that does not wait for evidence because it does not need it. This pattern did not begin with this administration, but it has been refined by it. In earlier decades, federal agencies at least pretended to slow down. Statements were vague, language was conditional. There was distance between an incident and a verdict. That distance was not always honorable, but it existed. It created space where facts could disrupt narratives. That space is shrinking. Today, the declaration comes first. The evidence is expected to catch up later, or disappear. In this case, senior officials moved almost immediately to describe a dead man as a violent extremist, not based on public findings, not supported by released evidence, just asserted, loudly, repeatedly, on camera, on social media, as if repetition itself could substitute for proof. That choice is not neutral. It is strategic.
And what they're saying, and the fact that, you already have people in the administration coming out and describing Alex Preddy as a would-be assassin, as a domestic terrorist, and yet when they get pressed to substantiate any of their allegations, they throw their hands up in the air and say,
labeling someone a terrorist is not just descriptive. It activates fear. It narrows sympathy. It frames questions as suspect. Once that word is used, anyone asking for clarity can be dismissed as naive or dangerous. Accountability becomes harder because doubt is rebranded as disloyalty. And here's the critical point. The government did not wait to see what the video showed. The video already existed. Multiple angles, civilian footage, surveillance views, all available before the story hardened. And yet the story hardened anyway. That tells you something. It tells you the narrative was not built on uncertainty. It was built to survive contradiction. Because once officials are on record asserting intent, they are no longer describing an event. They are defending an institution. And institutions, when threatened, tend to protect themselves before they protect the truth. This is where procedure starts to matter more than rhetoric. In a typical officer-involved shooting, there is a well-established chain. Independent investigators, separation of agencies, preservation of evidence, clear jurisdiction. That process exists for one reason: to prevent the people involved from controlling the outcome. In this case, that process fractured.
And they say that they were blocked from the scene by federal agents, both FBI and DHS. They had to go to court. They sought a temporary restraining order to preserve the evidence, and they got it last night. A federal judge, has ordered the federal government to preserve the evidence in this case. I've never seen that before. And the official who applied for this warrant said that in their 25 years on the job, they had never seen federal agents blocking local agents from the scene of a shooting like this.
Local authorities were blocked from the scene. Evidence preservation required a court order. A federal judge had to step in to stop potential destruction of material that should never have been at risk in the first place. That is not a technical dispute. That is an institutional failure. And when federal agencies insist on investigating themselves after using lethal force, it is not just inappropriate, it is corrosive. It erodes trust, not because people are emotional, but because people understand incentives. No organization is an honest judge of its own worst moment.
And as questions mount around the killing of Alex Purdy, sources tell MS Now's Ken Delanian and Carol Leonnig that DHS officials, not the FBI, will lead the investigation into the actions of its own officers.
The administration wants this framed as an isolated incident, a single bad night, a single dangerous individual. But the mechanics tell a different story. The speed of labeling, the resistance to outside review, the control of evidence, the refusal to align public statements with what the public can plainly see. Those mechanics are familiar. They have appeared before, in different cities, under different justifications, always with the same result, a widening gap between what authority claims and what reality records. And that gap is where the real danger lives. Because once the public learns that truth is optional in moments of force, every future encounter carries that knowledge forward. And that is only the beginning of this story. What makes this moment heavier is not just what happened on that street. It is what happened next inside the system that is supposed to slow things down. Because when force is used by the state, the real test is never the trigger pull alone. It is what the system does afterward. Does it open itself up or does it close ranks? Here, the reaction was not transparency. It was consolidation. The same department whose officers were involved asserted control over the investigation almost immediately. Not as a temporary measure, not as a logistical bridge, but as the primary authority. That decision alone broke with decades of practice in federal use of force cases, where outside agencies normally take the lead to avoid exactly this conflict of interest. That choice matters because investigations are not just about facts. They are about credibility. And credibility depends on distance. You cannot credibly investigate yourself in a case where the outcome threatens careers, budgets, and political standing. No amount of internal review language changes that reality. And the resistance was not subtle. Local investigators reported being blocked. Physical access to the scene was denied. Evidence preservation had to be enforced by a judge, not volunteered by the agency holding the weapons. That is not procedural friction. That is institutional defiance. When a court has to order the government not to destroy evidence in a civilian death, something has already gone wrong, deeply wrong. That step only happens when trust has collapsed. Now layer this on top of the public messaging. While lawyers were scrambling to secure evidence, senior officials were on television reinforcing a narrative that assumed guilt, intent, and threat. Not carefully, not conditionally, definitively. This creates a trap. Once leaders speak in absolutes, any later correction looks like retreat. Any admission of uncertainty looks like weakness. So the incentive becomes clear. Maintain the story at all costs. That incentive structure explains the silence when officials were pressed with basic questions. Was the gun visible? Was it raised? Was there a verbal threat? These are not complex legal puzzles. They are yes or no facts. And yet the answers never came. Silence in this context is not neutral. It is strategic. Because saying nothing preserves flexibility. It allows the narrative to harden without being pinned to a falsifiable claim. It shifts the burden onto the public to prove what the government refuses to clarify. And this is where pattern replaces coincidence. This administration has repeatedly treated oversight as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. Courts are framed as inconveniences. Inspectors general are sidelined. Independent review is cast as partisan interference. Over time, that posture becomes normalized. So when a shooting occurs, the reflex is not openness, it is control. Control of the scene, control of the timeline, control of the language. That is not about public safety. It is about institutional survival. And the cost of that survival strategy is cumulative. Each incident trains the system to move faster, explain less, and resist more. Each time, the gap between what the public sees and what officials say grows wider. Eventually, that gap becomes impossible to bridge. Because when citizens watch video that contradicts official statements, they are forced to choose which reality to trust. And once that choice becomes routine, legitimacy erodes quietly but permanently. This is not a question of ideology. It is a question of governance. A system that demands trust while refusing scrutiny is not stable. It is brittle. And brittle systems do not bend when pressure increases. They crack. What you are watching here is not just the handling of one death. It is the rehearsal of how power behaves when accountability threatens to catch up. And the consequences of that behavior do not stay contained to one case. There is another layer here that makes this harder to dismiss as a one-off. It is the way federal power has been repositioned over time. For years, border and immigration agencies had a defined scope, geographic limits, mission limits, political guardrails. They were controversial, but they were bounded. Their authority was supposed to be narrow because their tools are extreme. That boundary has been dissolving. What we are seeing now is not just enforcement, it is redeployment. Officers trained for one purpose are being placed into environments they were never meant to police. Neighborhoods, protests, civilian settings where escalation carries a very different risk profile. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened gradually. Policy memos, expanded tasking, public rhetoric that treats internal dissent as a security threat. Once that language takes hold, mission creep becomes justified. And mission creep always brings friction. Because agencies built for force do not de-escalate well. They dominate space. They control movement. They act first and justify later. That posture may function at a border checkpoint. It fails in a residential street. In this case, the presence of federal officers itself became the accelerant. Tensions rose because the posture was aggressive from the start. That is not speculation. Former officials have openly questioned why these units were deployed there at all, given their stated national security focus. That question has never been answered. Instead, the response has been to redirect attention, to argue about labels, to argue about intent, to argue about whether the dead man had a legal right to carry a firearm. All of those debates conveniently avoid the more uncomfortable issue of whether federal force belonged there in the first place. Because if it did not, then everything that followed rests on a faulty premise. And once you accept that premise, the rest of the behavior starts to look less like chaos and more like policy. The blocking of local authorities was not an accident. It was an assertion of dominance, a message about who controls outcomes when federal power is involved. That message was reinforced when the investigation stayed in-house despite overwhelming conflict concerns. This is where accountability breaks down structurally. If federal agencies can deploy internally, use lethal force, control the evidence, define the narrative, and investigate themselves, then oversight becomes performative. Courts are reduced to damage control. Legislators react after the fact. The public is left arguing with press statements. That model is not theoretical. It is observable. And it produces a chilling effect that goes beyond this case. Communities begin to see federal presence not as protection, but as risk. Officers begin to operate with the assumption that institutional backing is automatic. Leaders learn that speed and certainty beat caution and honesty. Over time, those lessons compound. This is why comparisons to the past matter. Not because history repeats cleanly, but because patterns repeat functionally. When armed authority is insulated from consequence, it expands. When expansion is rewarded politically, it accelerates. And when acceleration meets resistance, force is reframed as necessity. We are not yet at the end point of that trajectory, but we are well past the warning signs. The public argument right now is about one shooting. The real issue is about whether the machinery that allowed it is becoming permanent. Because once power learns it can move this way without immediate cost, it rarely chooses to slow down on its own. And that leaves a question hanging that no official statement has addressed. Not yet. There is a moment in every institutional failure where silence becomes louder than action. That moment has already passed here. Because after the initial claims, after the defensive briefings, after the refusal to answer basic questions, something else happened. Or more accurately, something did not happen. There was no immediate recalibration, no public narrowing of claims, no acknowledgement that statements might have outrun facts. Instead, the narrative stayed frozen in its most extreme form. That matters because governments correct themselves all the time when accuracy is the goal. They walk back language, they clarify, they soften certainty. None of that occurred here. And when correction does not happen, you have to ask why. The answer is not incompetence, it is risk management. Admitting error would not just affect this case, it would undermine a broader posture. A posture built on portraying internal force as defensive, necessary, and unquestionable. Once that posture cracks, it invites scrutiny elsewhere. So the safer option is rigidity. That rigidity shows up in how oversight is treated. Congressional concern is dismissed as theater. Court intervention is framed as obstruction. Public doubt is waved off as misinformation. Each response shrinks the circle of acceptable questioning. This is how systems train themselves to stop listening. And when systems stop listening, they stop learning. Mistakes repeat because they are never acknowledged as mistakes. They become normalized behaviors defended by habit rather than evidence. There is also a deeper institutional anxiety at work. The fear that conceding even a narrow point opens the door to wider accountability. If this shooting was mishandled, what about others? If this investigation is compromised, what about past ones? If this deployment was unjustified, what does that say about the strategy behind it? Those are not questions power once asked. So the focus shifts from actions to intentions, from procedures to labels, from structural responsibility to individual blame. The dead man becomes the subject. The system fades into the background. But the system is the only thing that persists. Individuals come and go. Officers rotate. Officials resign. Administrations change. The machinery remains. And if it is allowed to operate this way now, it will operate this way later under different circumstances, with different justifications. This is why precedent matters more than outrage. Once a federal agency establishes that it can block local investigators, retain control of evidence, shape public perception, and face minimal immediate consequence, that becomes the baseline, not the exception. Future cases will not have to invent new defenses. They will cite this one. And that is where the accumulation becomes dangerous. Not because any single incident collapses democracy, but because each one lowers the cost of the next. Each unresolved contradiction teaches power that persistence beats accountability. The public feels this even if it cannot always articulate it. Trust erodes not in dramatic collapses, but in quiet recalculations. People adjust expectations downward. They stop expecting clarity. They stop expecting honesty. They stop expecting answers. That adjustment is the real damage, because a democracy where citizens no longer expect truth from force is not yet broken, but it is no longer stable. And the most unsettling part is this: nothing about this story is finished. No final report, no external findings, no resolution. The system is still moving forward without having confronted what it has already revealed, which means whatever comes next will not arrive in a vacuum. It will arrive in the shadow of everything that has been allowed to stand. There is one more shift that cannot be ignored. It is the way this episode is already bleeding into areas that have nothing to do with the street where the shooting happened. Because once force is justified through narrative rather than proof, that logic does not stay contained. It travels. You can see it in how unrelated powers start getting pulled into the conversation. Voter data, state compliance demands, threats tied to funding, leverage that has nothing to do with public safety suddenly appears adjacent to a use of force controversy. That is not coincidence. It is opportunism. Moments of fear are useful. They soften resistance. They allow authority to ask for things it could not justify during calm. When the public is told danger is everywhere, scrutiny feels irresponsible. Questioning feels risky. And so the frame widens. What began as a shooting becomes a test of loyalty, a test of alignment, a test of whether institutions will push back or fall in line. Governors are pressured. Local agencies are sidelined. Courts are treated as obstacles instead of referees. This is not how accountability works. It is how power consolidates. The unsettling part is how quickly this consolidation feels normalized. There is no formal declaration, no emergency order announced with fanfare, just a series of moves that individually seem technical, but collectively redraw the boundaries of authority. Each move relies on the last one going unchallenged. If federal agents can operate internally without clear jurisdictional justification, then evidence control becomes easier. If evidence control becomes normal, then self-investigation feels defensible. If self-investigation stands, then narrative certainty becomes safe. If narrative certainty holds, then leverage becomes available. None of these steps require conspiracy. They only require momentum. And momentum is what this administration has mastered. The danger here is not just misuse. It is precedent stacking. Every time an extraordinary action survives without consequence, it becomes ordinary. Future officials will not have to argue for these powers. They will inherit them. This is where elections enter the picture, whether anyone admits it or not. When enforcement power and political pressure start overlapping, the line between governance and control blurs. Not dramatically, incrementally. And incremental erosion is harder to reverse because it never triggers a single alarm. People argue over personalities, over rhetoric, over tone. Meanwhile, the architecture shifts quietly beneath them. The courts are already straining under this weight. Judges can issue orders. They cannot manufacture compliance. Their authority depends on good faith. And good faith weakens when power learns it can test limits without immediate consequence. That tension does not resolve quickly. It accumulates. What you are watching is not a closed chapter. It is a system learning what it can get away with, adjusting, calibrating, preparing for the next test. And there will be a next test. The only unanswered question is whether the response will come from outside the machinery or whether the machinery will keep moving until resistance becomes structurally impossible. What makes this moment linger is not outrage. Outrage burns fast and disappears. What lingers is normalization. By now, the immediate shock has faded for most people. That is not a moral failure. It is how attention works. New stories arrive, new emergencies compete, life continues. And while that happens, the unresolved pieces of this story quietly settle into the background. Unanswered questions stay unanswered. Contradictions stay uncorrected. Procedural breaches stay unpunished. And that is how consequences accumulate without ever announcing themselves. No single press conference will resolve this. No internal report will restore what was lost. Even a court ruling, when it comes, will only address fragments. Because the real change already happened upstream, in expectations. Federal power learned it could move quickly, define reality early, and withstand visible contradiction. It learned that institutional friction can be absorbed, that delays favor authority, that time itself becomes a shield. The public learned something too. It learned that video evidence does not guarantee clarity, that official certainty can exist without proof, that asking basic questions can feel futile when the system answers with silence or deflection. Those lessons do not disappear when the headlines move on. They shape behavior going forward. They change how people respond to authority, how officers approach civilians, how agencies weigh risk, how leaders calculate what they can say and when. And none of that requires malicious intent. It only requires repetition. This is why the absence of resolution is the point. If this story ended cleanly, with accountability clearly applied and boundaries reaffirmed, it would be containable. But it is not ending. It is dissolving into precedent, into practice, into the quiet assumptions that guide the next deployment, the next statement, the next investigation. The machinery does not reset itself. It carries forward what it learns. So the real question is not what happens next week or next month. It is what happens the next time force is used internally and speed matters more than truth. The next time evidence conflicts with narrative. The next time courts hesitate and agencies test how far they can go. Nothing about this case suggests restraint is coming voluntarily. And that should leave you uneasy, not emotionally shaken, cognitively alert, because systems rarely announce when they cross a line. They just keep moving until the line disappears. This story is not over. It is still unfolding.